Hello and welcome back to the channel. So we're continuing on with our Space Marine reviews. This time we're looking at the drop pod from the Space Marine Codex. As always, let's get the shout out of the day dealt with. Going to Mr. XXFinXX. He's asking for battle reports. Now these are in the pipeline, the studio is still being built. The UK's had a shorter supply of materials, so I finally got a bit of materials now so I can begin building the studio. Won't be for a while, but keep your eyes peeled. So let's get on with today's video then, the drop pod. Coming in at 4 power level or 70 points, and it's one of your dedicated transport options. You of course need to select an infantry option within your list to take one of these. So let's begin with the keywords of note. Very simple, it's a transport and it's got the vehicle keyword. So not really much there to talk about. So let's move on to the datasheet. Of course, as it's an immobile vehicle, it's only going to have a few of these stats. So it's got a ballistic skill value of 3+, strength 6, toughness 6, wounds 8, leadership 8, and a 3+ save. So as mentioned, it doesn't move, it's immobile, it's got no weapon skill, so it's not fighting back, and of course therefore it means it's got no attacks. As for abilities, Angels of Death, because it does have a ranged weapon, so it will have the combat doctrines, and it explodes on a roll of a 6. When it's destroyed, and on a 6, units within 6 inches will suffer 1 mortal wound. So only a baby explosion there, nothing too dramatic. It's then got the death from above ability, so it effectively deep strikes in, usually from turn 2 onwards, but the next ability, as you'll see right now, it's got the drop pod assault ability, so effectively the transport can come in from turn 1, 2 or 3. You can also put more than half of your army into reinforcements, which is normally against the rules, but because of this ability it allows you to do that if they're within the drop pod. So once this drop pod does arrive in, the unit must immediately disembark, and it must be more than 9 inches away from enemy models after the disembarkation. Just be sure that you're not doing it from the actual drop pod itself, it's from the actual models that are disembarking from the drop pod. So of course it's a transport option, so you're going to get 10 chapter infantry models in. So this does not include jump pack models, Terminator models, Primaris models, Wolfen or Centurion models. So that kind of really limits exactly what can go into this drop pod, which we'll go over later in the video. As for the Wargear, it's got a Storm Bolter, 24-inch range, rapid fire 2, strength 4, no AP 1 damage. So at 12-inch range it's going to have 4 shots. It doesn't have the bolter discipline because it is a vehicle, so it does need to be within 12 inches to be firing for the double shots. It's not really going to do a lot if I'm honest. Toughness 3 models at best, it's probably going to remove 1 or 2, but other than that I wouldn't count on it too much. It will become a -1 AP weapon in turns 2 and optionally turn 3 because of the tactical doctrine. Now it does have a Wargear option, so you can swap out the Storm Bolter and replace it with the Deathwind Launcher. It's a free upgrade, it's only a 12-inch range but it's heavy D6, strength 5, no AP 1 damage, and it's got the blast ability. So strength 5 is going to be winning toughness 4 models on 3, so slightly better. And the amount of shots, although it is unreliable because it's got the D6 amount of shots, it does have the blast ability against those larger units. Again with the combat doctrines, the AP will go up by 1, but this time it will be in turn 1, which is a Devastator doctrine due to the fact that it's got a heavy weapon. As for some stratagems, well there's only one in fact, this Armour of Contempt, and it's not really worth using on a drop pod, but I've got to show you anyway because it's a vehicle, so you can ignore mortal wounds on a roll of a 5+ for 1 command point. Don't use it, I wouldn't use it, I've just got to mention it. As for some synergy, so as there's only a few units that can actually go inside the pod due to the majority of the codex having either the Primaris keyword or the Terminator, Centurion and whatnot, it really limits what can go inside it. So we've got the tactical squads, which are not that ideal as you can only get 1 or 2 decent weapons, so that makes the pod kind of pointless to use because the whole point of the pod is to get a unit in up close very early in the game, and in the same turn that they disembark they need to be removing a unit. Now when you've only got 1 or 2 decent weapons in that unit, it's not going to do much. You've also got Vanguard Veterans, they're also firstborn. They can be used without the jump packs, but because the jump packs are actually only 3 points each, so even a full unit of 10 men, it's only going to cost you 30 points to get the jump pack, so I'd stick with the jump packs because they also gain the deep strike ability themselves anyway. You've got company veterans, they're possible because they're firstborn as well. I don't see them too often if I'm honest, but they can all be kitted out with combi weapons or special weapons, so there could be an option if you wanted to. But our best option is for the Devastator unit, and even then the options are actually halved because there's no point in taking the Devastator with long range heavy weapons such as a missile launcher, a heavy bolter or a las cannon, so they're purely there for the multi-melters and possibly grav cannons, but those grav cannons actually have a 30-inch range, so you don't always want to use them, but if you wanted to you could use them. Now when you're taking the Devastators, you can opt for a single unit of Devastators with the option of adding a character for buffing the rolls, or go with 2 units of 5, which in turn gives you access to 2 lots of the Signum ability and 2 cherubs. So you have options either way. Also don't forget that the sergeant can also take a combi weapon, so either a combi grav or a combi melter to match the rest of the unit. So for those of you that weren't aware what the Signum is and the Cherub is, the Signum is in the shooting phase. Each time the unit shoots, if it contains the Marine Sergeant, you can select one model in the unit to have a ballistic skill value of a 2+, and the Cherub, which is 5 points, can effectively shoot again with one of your models. Ideally, you use both of these at the exact same time so that the person with the ballistic skill value of a 2+ is shooting again to make max use of both abilities. So a quick little glance at the Devastators with the 2 weapon options that I've already spoke about. Now I know this is a drop pod review, not a Devastator review, but because these kind of go hand in hand, we should really go through some of these Devastator options. So to quickly glance, the multi-muscle 24-inch range, heavy 2, strength 8, -4 AP, damage is D6, and it goes to D6 plus 2 if you're within half range. That's 20 points a model. Or the Grav Cannon, which is 10 points, 30-inch range, heavy 4, strength 5, -4 AP, and 1 damage. If you're attacking a model that's got a save characteristic of a 3+, then the damage goes to a flat 2. Now the issue is both of these weapons are heavy, so as soon as you're disembarking from the drop pod, the unit will be considered to have moved, so it's going to be a -1 to hit penalty due to their infantry keyword along with a heavy weapon. So a simple universal method to ignore this penalty is to use the stratagem Steady Advance. So you can do this in any part of the movement phase, so ideally when the drop pod's already arrived and you've disembarked. When an infantry unit makes a normal move until the end of the turn, they're considered to have stayed stationary, and it's 2 command points. It's quite pricey, but that's your best way of doing it. Now if you were to do it from other means such as your chapters, we'll go through those as well. So if you're playing Ultramarines, for example, you've got the Signs of Guilliman, which is in the tactical doctrine, so that's turn 2 or 3, so they're not going to be coming in turn 1 if you're going to be using this. And any unit that moves in the movement phase that did not advance or fall back can shoot their weapons as if they remained stationary. Again, so there'll be no -1 to hit penalty. And they've also got the Sons of Guilliman Stratagem, which is 1 command point used on an infantry unit in the shooting phase or the fight phase, but this will be the shooting phase. And you're effectively getting to reroll hit rolls of a 1, unless they're troops, then you get to reroll all the hit rolls, but Devastators are not troops. So re-rolling 1s isn't too bad. One last thing for the Ultramarines, you've got the Codex Discipline, so they're eligible to shoot in a turn in which they fell back. So if they get charged in the opponent's turn after you've came in, you can simply fall back and shoot with your good weapons. Of course it will be a -1 to hit penalty, but it's better than not shooting at all. If you're playing with the Iron Hands chapter, they've got Calculated Fury, so in the first term, which is the Devastator Doctrine, there's no penalty for moving and firing heavy weapons. Then in addition, whilst the Devastator Doctrine is active, they get to reroll hit rolls of a 1. So not only are they not incurring that penalty, but rerolling the 1s as well. That's 2 for the price of 1 there. Then the Iron Hands of the Mercy is Weakness Stratagem for 1 command point, done in the shooting phase or the fight phase. An Iron Hands unit that is selected to shoot. Once you select your target, unmodified wound rolls of a 6 will target the unit twice instead of once. So they've got to make 2 armor saves for every 1, so that's going to be really solid, especially for the melter weapons with the D6 damage, or the D6 plus 2, depending on where you are. And of course, those Grav Cannons, if you're going against power armor, it's going to be damage 2, and they've got to make 2 of those saves for each one as well, so pretty good there. The Salamander's got the Forged in Battle for a single reroll to the wound roll, so it's always good for your heavy weapons in particular. They've also got the Promethean Cult, which is their super doctrine, so in the tactical doctrine, so turn 2 or 3 optionally. If they make an attack with the flame weapon or a melter weapon, they're going to add 1 to the wound roll. Now, they don't actually have flamer weapons with this squad, but they do have multi-melters, so you'd pretty much be wounded on 2s with those. They've then got the Fires of Battle Stratagem for 1 command point, used in the shooting phase or in your opponent's charge phase for Overwatch. When you're shooting with the melter weapons, an unmodified wound roll of a 4+ will give out 1 mortal wound in addition to the normal damage, to a maximum of 3 mortal wounds per phase, which can be pretty brutal. It's only a 4+ roll, and if you kitted out your entire squad with multi-melters, that's going to be pretty good. They've then also got another stratagem, the Crucible of Battle for 1 command point, done in the shooting phase again on a core unit, and it simply adds 1 to the wound roll. Now, you've already got the +1 to the wound roll from the other stratagem with the melter weapons, but this one's particularly good for the Grav Cannons because that doesn't have a stratagem for a +1 to the wound roll, so you're using this one if you want to be wounded on 2s, potentially 3s, depending on the unit's toughness. Their last stratagem of note is Relentless Determination for 1 command point, used at the end of the movement phase on a Salamander's unit that did not advance or fall back. They're going to be treated as remaining stationary for this movement phase for the purposes of firing heavy weapons. So again, they're going to be coming out of that drop pod without the -1 hit penalty. If you take Vulcan Heston, which is a named character for the Salamanders, he's got an ability called Forge Father, done in the command phase, so you can't actually use it because the drop pod isn't actually in the battle in the command phase, but on the second round, once the actual drop pod has landed and disembarked your guys, then any melter weapons that are in that Devastator squad can reroll all the hit rolls and all the wound rolls. So if you do survive the first turn you come in and then your opponent's turn, of course, you can be using this combination if you wanted to. As for buffing the actual Devastators, again, I know it's not a Devastator review here, but I'm just trying to think of the best possible way of making the drop pod worthwhile. You've also got the option of putting a standard Firstborn Librarian in the mix. And in the Psychic phase, you can cast Psychic Fortress to give the unit a 5+ invulnerable save. You can also put a Firstborn Captain in there for the Rites of Battle Aura, to give core chapter units within 6 inches the rerolls to the hit rolls of a 1. The same applies to a Firstborn Lieutenant with a Tactical Precision Aura. This time you're rerolling 1s to wound. Now you've got the option of using a chaplain with a unit. Now the litanies actually happen in the command phase, so you've obviously missed the command phase because the drop pod doesn't come in until the movement phase. However, there is a stratagem called Command Oraturi for 2 command points, which allows the chaplain to recite one of the litanies that is in any of the other phases. So for example, it could be the movement phase, the shooting phase. So you're buffing your shooting attacks in particular with the chaplain. You just got to make sure that this chaplain isn't a Primaris chaplain because he isn't allowed to go in the drop pod. So on to the summary from the drop pod then. Let's start with the good. It gets Firstborn units into range to fire, pretty obvious. They can come in on turn 1, which is normally not allowed. Virtually everything else in the game comes in from turn 2 onwards, but the drop pod goes against those rules and comes in on turn 1, so it's pretty good. Really good for an alpha strike, getting rid of a unit straight away. Sometimes before your opponent even gets to have a turn with that unit, you can delete it. It can also be used to put more than 50% of your army into reserves. Again, it's sort of breaking the rules. You're meant to have 50% at the most into reserves, but they don't count anything that's in the drop pod, so technically you're going over 50%. It can also hold an objective, which is going to be a bit of a pain for your opponent to remove because it's not actually doing much else. Once it came in from Deep Strike, it's not really a major threat, but if it's holding an objective, it's a little bit of a pain in the backside for your opponent. And then finally, it can be used to block off enemy movement because it's got quite a large span, especially when those doors come out. I'm not exactly sure on what the rules are with the actual drop pod doors because they open and close. You'll have to let me know in the comments. Do they count as part of the hull when they're opened, or do you have to close the doors? I'm not exactly sure. Let's go on to the bad. So there isn't many Firstborn units within the codex. It's only the ones we mentioned earlier, and even then it's only really the Devastators that I'd consider taking. It's immobile, it can't move, it can't fight in melee, so it's not really doing much else really. Now it hides a unit that gets into melee with it from range attack. So if there's a weak enemy unit nearby, it simply has to charge the drop pod, and then effectively, because it's in combat with the drop pod, you cannot target that weak unit with range attacks. And if there is an objective, you've virtually gifted your opponent the objective because the only way to get rid of them is in melee. Which brings me on to the next point, which is although it can hold objectives, it's only a single model. So again, going back to that previous point, if you've got say a unit of 5 flayed ones from the Necron Codex, they're pretty weak, but they can just go into combat with the drop pod. You can't target them from range, and that's going to be considered 5 models holding an objective versus the 1 drop pod. It's also quite expensive for what it does. It is a very good alpha strike unit to get you guys in, but for 70 points, you've got to look at other options within the codex. You've got the jump pack options, you've got Terminator options. They're probably much better. They've got the Deep Strike ability or Death from the Skies ability. And also don't forget you've got reinforcements, so if you're using command points you can just bring any unit on from a table edge, which is almost as good, not quite as good, but almost as good as just coming in from Deep Strike. So let's get on with the rating today. This one's actually a tricky one because I can see a lot of players actually really liking this one, especially those Alpha Strike players that like to hit really hard, really early. They're normally Raven Guard players if I'm honest, and they don't really have a need to it because they've got all the buffs and stratagems and whatnot to do it without the drop pod. But today I'm going to be giving the drop pod a Planet 40k rating of 2 stars. So guys, do you agree with the rating? Let me know below. I think some of you will agree, some of you won't. It's a bit of an iffy one, this one. Partly chapter dependent, and it's also unit dependent as well. Not everyone plays Devastators, but just let me know below. Also remember, a random comment will be shouted out in the next Space Marine video. So guys, drop a like on your way out. Thank you all for watching, and as always, I'll see you next time.